Hi there, and welcome back to the Fuse Show. Today I'm joined by Stephen Hoelper. He's the president of the North America division of DocAir, the first global network of physician-only platforms for programmatic messaging. Before joining DocAir, he was a VP of Innovation and Products at Comcast-NBCUniversal. He was also a founding member of Merck's skunkworks digital solution division and Vree Health, a digital services startup and subsidiary of Merck. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, David. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, for the sake of our audience, can you tell us a little bit more about how DocAir, what you all do, and how did you all get started?
Sure. So DocCare is a programmatic marketing company that reaches physicians through professional media, professional social media, as well as electronic medical records and telemedicine platforms. So what we do is we broker messages between life sciences companies. You think of your pharmaceutical companies, your medical device companies, your digital therapeutic companies, anyone who wants to get a message to physicians in an environment where they're working, so it's natural for them and contextual. We will essentially make that connection. And what we find is that because it's within the workflow of physicians, they're more accepting to those messages because it's actually when they need to learn about different topics. So I've worked in life sciences or digital health for about 20 years, and it's been kind of a natural expression of my background to join DocCare. Been here for about 3 or 4 months.
Would you happen to know the origin story of the company and how it
I
came
do.
to be?
Yeah, our founder and global CEO, his name's Harshit Jain. He's a physician. He trained in the United States. And his aspiration was he practiced medicine for a while. He worked in in the agency side of the pharmaceutical world. So he had been running innovation, and he ran different country units in Europe and in Southeast Asia and in the United States. So he had this idea to figure out like how can you best get messages in the hands of physicians when they actually need it. And from a pharmaceutical or life sciences company or medical device company, how do you get the right physicians to receive that message, and how do you know that they're receiving it? So kind of his vision in starting the company was to solve this age-old challenge of how to reach physicians and how to make it meaningful and how to interact with them on their own terms. And that's been difficult because um, there's a lot of regulations about how you can communicate drugs globally. You know, for example, in the United States, you can communicate to consumers like myself and you directly through television advertising, but in the rest of the world, that's really not an option. So one of the things to do is to kind of keep this on the professional physician side to make sure that there's kind of some sanctity in the way that pharmaceutical advertising or other medical device advertising is done through the physician specifically instead of to the patient.
Can you tell me about the ideal user of your platform? Like, who is it that this platform is geared towards?
Sure. So there's two types of users. There's large brands that come from companies that you probably know of that want to do in-house programmatic marketing. So they want to take a little control back on how they're spending their media and how they're monitoring it and how they're being able to report on it. We also have agency partners who have direct relationships with those brands as well. And they are kind of the strategic partner for many of these brands. They help them with creative, they help them with campaign design. And oftentimes those become really important partners for us as they are kind of doing broader creative campaigns and making sure that the pharmaceutical or life science brand or medical device brand can meet like an overall campaign promise to their clients.
Can you tell me how this platform identifies like users as either like physicians or non-physicians? Because I imagine that's like a key component of how the whole thing works.
It is one of the challenges that if you're talking about a physician that's in a professional media site, so that's somewhere where they get education, it might be a journal or something like that. Um, Everything that we do is authenticated, so it's people that sign in and are authenticated. So if it's an electronic medical record, they have a user name and an ID, and they consent and they can opt out if they wish. And that's one of the ways that we're dealing with the really big changes that, it's called, if you're a marketer, it's called a, cookie deprecation, where some of the browsers, et cetera, are not allowing for cookie tracking. So the good thing is about this business is kind of forward thinking in that, we are using people that are identified, they are consented, they're behind a firewall, so to speak. And that allows us to be able to identify who they are appropriately and send the right message to them at the right time.
As more and more companies move towards digital forms of documentation, how do you see that affect companies like your own?
Well, I think the trend towards more digital everything, if you look at the electronic medical record space, hospitals and health systems, they are all going through digital transformation right now. As a matter of fact, so are the pharmaceutical companies internally. So that trend continues. The more digitization happens, I think we ride along with that wave, because all of our interactions with physicians and their offices are digital. So the way that we're interacting with them naturally, we can basically ride the wave of that trend. And what you'll see more and more is as hospitals begin to continue to go through their digital transformation, and we feel that experience change as a consumer, it'll become very obvious that there's this new healthcare ecosystem evolving that's actually been, from my experience, it's been accelerating greatly since COVID-19. I hate to bring up COVID-19 because we're all living in it, but the pandemic has really shifted a focus on the pharmaceutical industry, on the medical device industry, on digital therapeutics, to interact with their consumers in a digital way. And it's the same thing that's happening with the hospitals, more digitization, which means more patient records that are digital, which means more intake and appointments that are available. So that's been a really accelerated trend in the last 12 or 16 months.
So when you think about this entire ecosystem of digital transformations for health-based companies and medical-based companies, what is the scope? Like, what are all the related elements in this ecosystem that you think are going to be most impacted?
So I often wonder whether life sciences companies that have sales representatives that physically go into offices, how impacted they are by the continuation of a pandemic. The reason why I say that is because I know in some categories, like, for example, oncology, I know the physicians and other people that work in the office who are treating patients every day, they're not necessarily comfortable with seeing a lot of people come. And I know some hospitals have kind of shifted their policies to who can come, when can they come, what conditions can they come, do they need to be vaccinated? I think that is a really interesting area. And the reason why it's interesting is because those life science companies for probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years, they've been looking at telereps, which is kind of a more virtual type rep experience. And I think, again, this pandemic has kind of necessitated that to become a reality. So I think the interaction with those companies becomes a little different. And I would say also on the patient care side that I cannot personally see a future without telemedicine. You have telemedicine for behavioral health, you have telemedicine for routine checkups and primary care, you have telemedicine for specialist visits. Now, that does not replace in-person procedures that you need to go to. It does not replace radiology that you need to get. It does not replace laboratory results or labs that you need to obtain to monitor your condition. But for the most part, I think this, the trend towards virtualization will probably stick around, and hopefully it's for the better. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've had some pretty good experience given the circumstances with healthcare in the last 12 months. And I'm just hoping the convenience of that sticks around.
I noticed this trend in my own experiences where the more modern the tech stack and tools that a hospital or medical office uses, generally the easier of an experience I have. So I understand it's like one of those things where like the engineering department and the physician like quality obviously are probably not all that, like there's like a very weak correlation if at all.
Mhm.
But as a consumer, I just notice I have a smoother experience when the website is beautiful, the app actually works,
I,
as opposed to like having also these random bugs.
I totally agree with you. I think what's happening in the hospitals is there's this role since electronic medical records have been kind of pervasive. They have a chief medical information officer who is essentially responsible for figuring out how to leverage information or data to make the place work better, to get better outcomes, to treat people better, to even optimize how billing happens. And as a result of that, you see a lot more people kind of shifting to a consumer focused approach, thinking about what is the user experience from, showing up at the hospital to leaving, and even, if you have to have a follow-up appointment. So, I think you see kind of not in every case, but you see in a lot of hospitals, they take like a lean startup mentality where they're trying to apply design thinking to the overall customer experience, and they're really thinking of a consumerized experience. And that's evident when you look at how you can log in for an appointment, how you get maybe an SMS message before 2 days before you show up, whether you can pay for the appointment in different ways. All of those things are starting to come in and change the experience. There's a long way to go, but there's definitely some positive steps that I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years.
If you were one of these information officers, what would you do if you were in charge of a hospital and were trying to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what I would do, and this is kind of lending from my experience of running innovations team, I would probably build a little kind of customer experience or innovation team that's kind of very cross-functional. Have some nurses, have some people, physicians that are on the front lines. Make sure you have people that are kind of on the IT side, on the billing side, and kind of do what an IDEO or a Frog Design does, and think through what is the full experience when you arrive and what happens when you leave. I would probably leverage as much data as is available to kind of predict and proactively create experiences. So instead of having people fill out, one of the things from my personal experiences in going to hospitals is when you meet a new physician, they literally ask you the same thing. Oh, what's your birthday? And they ask you why you're here. And it's like, if you're there for a couple of days, it's actually pretty frustrating. The other thing you'll notice in those settings is there's all these beeps happening, and you're wondering why none of these beeps are getting responded to. Because people have, they get fatigued from some of the alerts of some of the medical devices that are in the suites. But at any rate, I mean, I would really put together a user-centered design firm to kind of test, trial different things in different areas of the business. And quite frankly, the more that, because healthcare is a very local thing, the more that you can engage the local community in that process, bring in patients, bring in caregivers, and get their feedback, the better you'll be. I mean, that's the type of experience I'd want to have if I were going to a hospital. It's more of let's think of it not as a hospital, more of a hotel. I understand you have to go there for some procedure, but the experience should be as good as possible, because in some cases the circumstances for your visit are not great. So make it great when you can.
Earlier, you were mentioning how the pharmaceuticals industry and the sale and I guess the pharmaceutical reps have to have an entirely different process during COVID, and probably potentially even indefinitely if the world and based on how the world responds to COVID long term. If you're a pharmaceutical company, how would you handle things to stay on top of like the digital trends towards the way things are going now?
So I will say the pharmaceutical companies are actually well on their way. Like digital, if you speak to them individually, you'll see a lot of them are focused on digital innovation. They're thinking digital first. Now, I think it's, they have an existing business model. So the telerepping is what they call the kind of telemedicine type visit with a sales rep. That's been helpful, being able to request samples, so pharmaceutical samples or device samples, easily through technology, being able to interact with a sales rep through a chat feature, those types of things. I know that many of the companies have kind of dipped their toe in the water in a lot of the topics that I just mentioned.
Hmm.
The question is, does that apply for each brand that they have? Is it make sense for every
Mm.
specialty that they serve? Because some of them are in small practice, some of the customers are in small practices, and some of them are in big hospitals, and it's a very different experience. Um, the life science companies also have, physicians and other, people with advanced degrees like PhDs that do kind of they serve as a medical liaison for the company, so they interact with a lot of the medical staff in the hospitals, health systems, and physicians' offices. So I'd be thinking about how to maximize the resources that the life sciences companies can provide that's non-promotional in nature to those doctors, to make sure the doctors have they're educated on the products, and possibly have opportunities for continuing medical education. Um, so there's a lot that can be done. What I would say is that
Hmm.
the industry is very interested in piloting things, but they're not always, not everything scales, because they do take a pretty deliberate approach on testing things and figuring out if they're
Hmm.
getting the right business results. So I would say, the first thing is to, if you don't have one already, establish a digital innovation function. Give those team members some permission to test things out and fail occasionally, but always measure and get results. Learn from your failures, and just kind of be comfortable with that. Set some budget aside, that's not necessarily associated with the brand, so they can experiment. But actually, when I was at Merck, I ran a team like that, and the best thing that we did was set aside specific and deliberate funding to innovate. And we ended up commercializing a bunch of other products that were in the digital health space. But the reason why we were able to get success is because we had some time, we had some money, and we were able to kind of use that as a way to test new innovations with the brands. And that seems to work.
I feel like experimentation is almost a necessity for innovation to happen.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Can you can you walk me through some of the experiments you've done in your past that you felt like or led to like major wins?
I sure can. Well, I'll go back to when I was in research, because that was where I kind of learned software engineering. I was in a laboratory setting where it was all carbon paper, and you'd run like thousands of samples through this lab. You'd have to figure out where they were. And when I was going back to school for software engineering, I kind of started putting, I put a business case together to say, hey, if we automated this whole process, we could save X amount of dollars. So um, one of my executive director at the time, he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go down to the archives, and I want you to pull an entire stack of paper from this study. And I want you to give a presentation to these pathologists, which are the scientists that run this area. And I want you to make the proposal to build this software. And when you're done, I want you to go under the table, get that stack of paper and slam it on to make your point. So I did. And he arranged for the vice president of the area to be there, who was the person that actually had the money to do this. And that presentation actually impressive enough to say, okay, if I'm believing that that's the value proposition that you can get, and this is the change that you can impact, I'll give you the money. Now, that's not a direct experiment, but what that was is kind of the way to raise money in a big company. It was kind of use this
Hmm.
demonstrable, visible thing to encourage the scientists to fund the project. And it was highly successful. It's still in use today. It was the first of its kind. I can tell you later, when I moved over to the commercial side of the pharmaceutical business at Merck, I was in an innovation group, and it was a technology innovation group. Now, we had started looking at digital health. This is before app stores existed. So we had been looking at different technologies. We looked
Hmm.
at Nokia had the Symbian platform, and Apple was just emerging. I think the iPod Touch was out, but the iPhone wasn't. And BlackBerry was one of the things that we were looking at. So we were looking at how to get the company past pill and vaccines. So we were coming up with a bunch of apps that, we built an app for chemotherapy, an app for Coppertone, the consumer brand, an app for an app called Vree for diabetes, which was basically it was a certified diabetes educator that's someone who actually helps people who are newly diagnosed learn about diabetes, how to manage it. We actually digitized that person with a lot of content and some science around getting people motivated to change on their own. So we kind of built this little practice of mobile apps, but we did that by showing this first prototype for diabetes. We showed it to the chief information officer. We got an audience with the chief strategy officer. And essentially the pitch was, we think pharmaceutical companies can do something much more than pills and vaccines. Although important, there is an opportunity for us to get into digital therapeutics and apps and things of that nature. So it wasn't until we kind of built a prototype and showed it around is where we started getting traction. And candidly, I think over a period of years, we probably had 300,000 users, which was pretty good for the scheme of a health app. But I would say in terms of a commercial success, it wasn't that. But the point is it led not only Merck to get into that space, but other pharmaceutical companies to kind of get into the digital health space and think differently about their business. And you can even see this today when we were early in that. But what's interesting, if you look at other pharmaceutical companies and brands, they've done solution type services. And, I like to think it's partially because of the experiment that teams like us did in the early days. But, it was being able to fail and learn and repeat and, get that product in front of the end users and iterate on it was super important to the way that we were able to get some semblance of success.
For the prototype that you just mentioned, how long did it take to build?
So it's interesting. When we did that, there was no app standards. So there's no style guide at the time. So I think we were doing sprints back then. So we were doing Agile Scrum. We would see the software developed every 2 weeks. We'd have design sessions in between that to enhance it. We would go and get feedback. We scheduled some focus groups. So I would say the first actual prototype that was worthy of getting in front of people probably took us 2 months. And then we ended up launching it. It took quite a bit longer because we, quite frankly, in a big company, it's not always easy to get things through. And I remember Apple at the time, it was very stringent about what they approved on the App Store. So we were kind of that was new too. So we were kind of learning that. And I remember being super paranoid about messing up because if you messed up there, they started the clock back and you had to go back to the review. So if you had an actual launch date and there was something wrong in the app, Apple would say they'd flag it, you got to go fix it, and then you'd actually have to go physically fix it, resubmit it, and then the clock starts all over. So that was super strenuous. But I will say that I remember the app we did for Coppertone, we did in 5 weeks end to end, and then launched it on Good Morning America. And that was really successful. And that was not because we were superstars, it's because what we learned from the apps that came before that, we switched to more, we went away from waterfall and requirements to more design-centered, user-centered design. So, we built the app the way it looked. We had the development team work in sprints. There were 2-week sprints. We got it done in 3, and just in time to get it launched on a national platform, which was awesome. And that app went on to it was Editor's Choice, new and noteworthy. So that was really nice. But yeah, that was based on what we learned, though. That's not because we were great at it at the time, because it was still early days then.
If you go back to that era of your career, what are some of the principles that you've learned then that still remain true today?
So I read some of your background as well. You're an avid reader or audiobook, as I am. I consume a ton of them, probably upwards of 15 or 20 a year as well. And so some of the principles that I've learned, when I was at Merck, I actually went through Six Sigma black belt training, So that was kind of an intense process improvement. And, you have to save a certain amount of dollars and, go in front of a panel of black belts and they certify you. So that kind of informed some of the way that I think about efficiency. But then again, as I started getting into product development, and I read, Eric Ries's Lean Startup, and I read, any book that I could find on design thinking. So, I kind of, all of those methods, if you're a purist on them, have their flaws, in my opinion. So I kind of take things around, okay, Lean Startup, what did I learn from that? I learned, well, get feedback, build a prototype and get feedback right away. I mean, that's what I learned from that. On the Six Sigma side, it's, build things for efficiency the first time you do it to the extent that you can. So that's what I take away from that, or to optimize and make efficiency a priority. And that's especially important in startups because you start with running some more, and then at some point you have to stop and optimize. So that's there's a balance of growth there too. On the product development and design thinking side, that's really about empathizing with your users, making sure that you really understand them, and then kind of cutting through some of the clutter with the data. Like, don't be fooled by one of the principles that I try to avoid is sunk cost bias. And that's when you spend a lot of time on something and then you keep going. You're keeping going because you don't want to like throw away all the work you did. And I have to tell you, that's not a good place to be in innovation. You have to be able to throw in the towel and say, this is what I learned from that. So that's a couple sampling of things, but I like to kind of use methods from different areas. Just because, like I said, no philosophy is perfect, but if you can find one that works for you and your teams, that's a good day.
So those are some of the more business principles that you've obtained. What about some personal principles you've either built or maintained over your career?
So one thing I'll tell you, and it's relevant to my role at Doceree as well, is that I have learned that making sure you treat your team that works for you well. People don't often think about this. You think, oh, well, I might say I worked for this person before and they're a rock star and, hopefully I can get a job with them again and I'm going to follow that person around. That's one way to look at things. What I've learned recently, because when I was interviewing for this job, it was actually one of the people that used to work for me in another role. And I had another job that I was interviewing for, and it was another person that used to work for me that asked me to apply for that role. Now, what I learned from that is it's really important to treat your people with respect and coach them and mentor them and make sure that they have exposure to, like, David, some of the things that you just asked me about, the business principles. Make sure that they are exposed to them. Make sure that they learn them for themselves, because they remember that. And, you can find your next role, and you may not think it's going to come from someone that used to work for you. But, and just today I had a call from a product manager that used to work for me, looking at another role. He was kind of grateful for an introduction I made him. And I think those types of experiences with people that I've touched, or they've taught me something in return, that's really fulfilling. So just treating people right, making sure that you teach people everything to the extent that they care to learn, and you'll have a great team for your next startup or your next job, and maybe it works out that they find you a role. So that's one. I would say from a leadership perspective, just trying to be as humble as possible and listening and learning and kind of taking advantage of reverse mentoring. And when I say that, it's, someone who works for me may assume that they can learn something from me, but I should not discount the fact that I can definitely learn something from them. And that's especially important when you're a knowledge worker, because, as we all get older, I mean, here's the reality of things. We all get older. Technology changes at a seriously rapid pace. And if you're not doing what you do and reading, 14 books a year, it's really easy to be left behind. And so to the extent that you can use people in your network to continuously learn, that's a huge thing. And I would say I'm a huge advocate of continuous improvement learning. Like
Hmm.
I cannot tell you how much graduate school and or certificates and or um, I just finished a data science program a couple months ago. That's super important just to keep fresh and keep your
Hmm.
career going.
How many of those courses have you done now? So you started with
Well,
biology, and then you also did what else have you done? You done software
so
engineering.
I started, so I started in biology and environmental science, and then I went to software engineering. I went to Babson College for my MBA, and along the lines, I've gone to Penn for a variety of scaling ventures and organizational behavior, and I finished that data science program in statistics in Python at Columbia a couple months ago. So probably too much. I think I probably wasted most of my, not wasted, I probably invested a lot of my time in my 20s when I should have been having more fun working and going to school. But in retrospect, it was worth it for sure.
Do you have a favorite course or set of courses that you've taken, or a favorite program? Just for any reason at all.
I have to tell you, I really love the applied data science program that I just took. I mean, I think it was 10 weeks of, getting acclimated to Python and how to use it. And then the back half of that, which I think was 12 weeks or so, was applying it. So using statistical methods, applying that through Python. It was actually really fun. And the
Hmm.
people that I met through that experience were really wonderful too. And you get to learn. That's a good way to network too. When you're doing a course like that, where you're actually all working and you have to help each other, that's where you make friends pretty quickly.
So over the course of all of these different programs that you've learned, what's the thing that motivates you, like that, like constantly like pushes you forward? Like what's your end goal, if you have one, or like a North Star that you live by?
So that is a great question. I'd probably start with it. It's probably centered on a fear of being left behind, which may be rational or not. But I think I'm pretty intrinsically motivated. Um, Learning's important, and it's not something that I like. If I go back to high school, I was a fine student, but I wouldn't say that I didn't really develop until I was in college. It didn't click to say that I could be successful in anything.
Hmm.
So after getting some experience, and I think part of it is you get older, you learn how to learn efficiently.
Hmm.
So I think I think back to college, you go away and you're like, oh my goodness, I just consumed an entire semester of work in a week, because that's basically what it's like compared to high school. And then, you don't really know how to learn. You're just, reading as much as you can, trying to learn, talk to people. So I think what keeps me going is it goes back to the kind of Six Sigma black belt training, is that I like to make my time as efficient as possible. So if I have any drive time, it's going to be filled with an audiobook or a podcast, because what else are you going to do? I mean, I actually don't even listen to music unless I'm trying to focus at work, ironically, because that's where I can kind of get some uh, me time, personal development time. Um,
Do you have a favorite
so
audiobook?
um, I have a lot of favorite audiobooks. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people that only reads professional things. So
That's okay.
I think I there's a few big data books that I think my favorite one is, there's a product development book, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it is the quintessential how to build a product team, how to um, what the ratio of engineers to product managers is, the QA. It's a really good read, but a lot of the other ones that I've read have been really intriguing, have been around uh, big data or data science. And the other one, which I'm super passionate about, which I think you are as well, is like I've read every book on every startup. So the book about Marissa Mayer at Yahoo, the book about Elon Musk, any book around Sam Walton. So any of those folks have they're not
Hmm.
startups now, but these are really interesting reads. But I have to say, the one specifically that I'll tell you that I really, really enjoyed is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight about Nike. And it's fascinating how that company got started and what he had to do. But yeah, anything that's about a startup story, I love it.
I had a guest last week, and Shoe Dog was also their favorite book. And then
Oh, shoot.
I
Yeah,
was also,
it's great.
I just bought the book last week, and I think I have like two more books to read, and then I'll start Shoe Dog. But I am excited for it.
Now, another one I really like is it's unfortunate because Tony Shea passed away not too long ago, but Delivering
Right.
Happiness that is a
Mhm.
fascinating book, especially if you like. It's kind of the merger between culture and startup culture and an actual startup. I mean, it's a fascinating read. It's really well done.
Hmm.
But I think my all time favorite book is about Theranos. If you haven't read that,
Oh, Bad
that book
Blood?
is fantastic. Bad Boy. If
Okay,
you
all
have
right.
not read that, that is a fantastic book.
That is my most recent audiobook purchase.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm telling you right now that you'll be listening to that as much as you can before you get it done. I've talked to people who have read the book, listened to the audiobook, and they can't put it down.
I had this problem where I can start a book and I was like, shoot, that book is so interesting. I don't want to do anything, including sleep. So I'll just like stay up until like 2 in the morning. Oh shoot, it's 2 in the morning. I really should sleep at this point. But the books are just so interesting sometimes.
I have this other problem where I get ADD and I literally find myself reading five books at once. Um, that's never a good thing, but
Does it ever keep you up at night?
um, no, I appreciate my sleep.
Okay. That's fair.
I'm more of a I'd get sleep at night and get up early and get started. I like the early hours. There's a block of 2 or so hours where I really get a lot of focus time done.
Hmm.
Either that or catch up with correspondence or read various professional things. That's really a nice time in the morning to get started before the team comes
You
on
mind if I
online.
ask you when you set your alarm to?
I get up around 5:40 each morning, which is
Okay.
not too early, too late. I have about a 40-minute commute, which is actually, in my opinion, that is the optimal time because I can
I
get
think so
through
too.
that's how that's what happens when you like audiobooks. It's like I need enough time to get through this because if I have a 9 hour book, how long that's going to take me weeks to finish. So,
there was
but
a
you can really get
stage in
through a
my
few
career
podcasts.
there was a stage in my career where I wanted to be as close to the office as possible. So I found an apartment at 10 minutes from the office. But I realized that like my audiobook time went significantly down because it takes a few minutes for me to like remember like where did I pick off in the audio Bible? Oh,
Yeah,
that's where I left off, and then like apply that context again. And it's like, oh shoot, now I'm in the office again. Like that was like literally 5 minutes of like new content, and it's not the same.
it's not the same, and it's tough. One of the things through the pandemic when I was working from home for months and months, over a year, is I mean, I feel my Audible account, like I had all these credits, I couldn't use them because I wasn't in the same. My habit was so broken that what I
Hmm.
started doing is I got up early, I walked around the block, listened to my audiobook or got some exercise. That's how I kind of changed my routine.
I don't usually listen to audiobooks when I clean the house, but now during COVID, I picked it up as a habit because I feel like you're right. I'm just like, shoot, like my Audible annual subscription is about to renew, and I still have like three more credits.
Yeah, and they start yelling at you like, "Hey, you're gonna lose these credits." It's like, I'm not losing. I'm not losing them. I'm gonna binge purchase 10 books right now. Yeah.
What are some of the things that you've learned in recent years that you wish you knew, call it like 5 to 10 years ago?
I think I'll tell you this might be a relatively embarrassing story, but I will say that in one of the innovation functions I led, I was sometime in my 20s, and the chief information officer of this company told me, just get it done, plow through whomever you have to make this happen. And I kind of listened to that advice. which in hindsight, it's something I probably not would have done because it came back to haunt me at some point later in my career, is that, um, it wasn't that I was, overly aggressive or anything like that. It was, the passion of trying to get something done that was truly innovative and could make a big difference. And, what I learned from that was some of the people that I needed to participate. Now they worked with me at that time and they got done what was asked. And the only reason that happened like that in a big political organization is because I had, the permission of a senior executive. But here's what happened after that. One of the persons I ended up working for later in my career, and it kind of set a sour note on that because it's kind of one of these bull in the china shop things where I was tasked to get this done, and I'm going to get it done no matter what. And that person didn't forget it. And
Hmm.
quite frankly, I just learned that anyone you interact with, it doesn't matter if they're a vendor, if they're a coworker, if they're in another department, you're going to see those people again, especially if you work in a niche industry. If you think, pharmaceutical or the healthcare industry or one of those, even the music or television industry, they're not as big as you think they are. So you're going to come across those people. So, my word to the wise is just make sure you treat everyone with
Hmm.
respect, make sure you're collaborating. And then, if you want to take it to the next level, make sure that they can share in your success somehow, because to me, that's the best way to make sure people are
Hmm.
coming along board with you. Um, these statements might be in contrast to what I was telling you about leadership earlier, but that's part of what formed my philosophy later in my career, based on what I actually learned and experienced and what bruises and band-aids I had from it.
I imagine part of your role as a president at Doc Air is to raise the next generation or hire the next generation of leaders. What do you look for? What is your definition of a good leader?
I'm looking for people that, well, I mean, the first thing is, and this is true of any startup, I mean, you need people that are self-starters that can come in, assess the situation, understand what opportunities there are for improvement, and get a team organized, um, to meet whatever objective that we're trying to achieve. Now, that sounds simple, but what you're looking for in a leader is someone who can actually stand up an organization. Like that is there's kind of two skill sets that I would say are super important. And one of them that goes back to the story I just told. Influencing without authority is
Hmm.
super important. And I don't care what level, I don't care if you're the CEO, president, or anyone else, because there's always a situation where someone else is your boss, whether it's a board member or an investor or the CEO or a peer. You don't have direct authority, accountability over those people. So, I mean, influencing without authority is seriously an important trait, and you can be right out of school or a senior executive, but that's a very important
Hmm.
trait. And as I started to mention before, I think organizing a team, setting it up from scratch, figuring out what processes this team's going to need to be successful, what metrics are they going to need to be measured on, that is super important. You can't, you know, you're not going to see performance if you're not measuring things. So that, having a measurement system is super important. Having a process and that's repeatable and you can kind of grow and scale a team is super important too. You see a lot of people in startups where there's less structure. Um, they're not performing well. Sometimes they're not performing because they haven't been given a platform to be successful. So,
Hmm.
making sure that people have a platform that, and one of my big things is someone who can remove impediments. Impediments are, something that stops you from doing work, from being successful, from getting a sale, from delivering a product. Doesn't matter what it is. Focus as a leader on impediment removal, and your team will feel much, much better about working with you because that's oftentimes what gets in their way. Um, so
Hmm.
that's probably the three people that three recommendations I'd say for any leader.
How do you take someone within your organization and like train them to become a better leader? Like, do you have a philosophy around that? Or is there a set of I don't know practices that you think are appropriate and effective?
Well, I think the main thing is that you actually have to spend time with people. So So part of what I learned is making sure you're being respectful to people, especially if you're coming in new somewhere, because oftentimes whether there's a founder or there's people that are instrumental to starting a company, a founding team or something like that. Sometimes those folks are, they feel like they've tried everything. They feel like maybe they're not being listened to at some point. So I think the first thing I would say is make sure you're listening to what their needs are. Figure out how to remove impediments, as I said before. But really listening, putting together a way for them to be successful and showing them the path forward. I find that, spending a little time with people can make a difference, a significant difference. Now, it depends on how much time you have. Sometimes people aren't a good fit. Depends on their seniority. But the other thing you want to watch out for is if you have someone that, can be receptive to coaching, and also is going to then coach downward on their team. So, the bigger it differs depending on how big or small your organization is. But to me, I think setting clear expectations and being honest with people, having honest conversations, not hard conversations per se, but being honest with expectations and such, and asking them if they're, are they on board for that change? Can they make that change? I think those kind of honest, transparent conversations help a lot. The worst thing you can do is just not tell people. Don't, if you want to, if you don't want to be successful, don't tell them why they're not being successful. Don't tell them, hold back on feedback. I mean, you want to give feedback, and you want to, one of the ways that I give feedback is I usually ask for people, can I give you some feedback? That's an invitation. So if they say yes, it's a different tone. And then I usually, say something like, I feel like you represent this core value and you do a really good job of it. And I feel like you would represent this other core value if you did this XYZ more effectively. And just notice the nuances. I'm saying I feel, and I'm kind of balancing that feedback. And it sounds it sounds like pretty intuitive that you balance feedback. But the whole mechanism of asking for permission, giving that to them in a very constructive way. And then, quite frankly, what I would ask is if you receive feedback, you just simply say, thank you for the feedback. It doesn't have to be a discussion. It doesn't have to be a dialogue. But, I just feel like if people don't receive feedback, that you're not giving them a chance and you're doing them a huge disservice.
Okay. I had one last question. What advice would you give to those who are entrepreneurially minded, who are watching this episode?
So I would say, I'm going to give you two things on this because I've done a lot of corporate entrepreneurship and as well as work in startups. Now, I would say on the corporate side, if you're an entrepreneur inside of a big company, test, show results, do it in small ways, get permission, build on innovations over time, and that will give you that will help you build more and more credibility inside the big organization to get funding, to do projects, to do more innovative things. Now, on the startups side of things, my advice is find something that you're ultimately passionate about and put everything into it. Surround your time with learning as much as you can about the space. Talk to as many customers and prospective customers as possible. Get as much feedback on your company, on your product, and make sure you use it. Don't ignore what you're learning. Like I said earlier with sunk cost bias, don't ignore that because you've gone so far. Pivoting is a tough thing, especially if you have investors that are asking you to hit numbers. But pivoting time and time again has provided huge value to companies that we know today. Twitter was not Twitter. It pivoted because Apple came out with podcasts, and that's what they used to do. That's a good book too. So I would say keep with it, learn as much as you can, get as much feedback as your customers, listen to people inside at every level to make sure that even, someone at a low level who's operating something, make sure you listen to what they have to say, because that's where you're going to find the other opportunities for improvement, either to serve your customers better make more money or come up with a new product offering.
Okay. That's been it's been a great hour of great advice. Thanks for your time, Stephen.
Oh, thank you, David. I
I just want
appreciate
to
it.
give
Thanks
you an
for having me.
opportunity. Is there any if like some of our guests and visitors want to follow along in either your company or your personal journey, what's the best way for them to do so?
They can email me at stephenholper@docare.com, and happy to get in touch.
Sounds good. Well, thanks
Or
again for your
connect with
time.
me on LinkedIn.
Okay, we'll have both of those on the landing page.
All right. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.